All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Brianna Coma, and I'm with Conservation Nebraska. Thank you so much for being here again, and I'm so excited to learn about solar farms and the solar energy. A couple of reminders while we let people trickle on in here. Um, you are all muted and your cameras are off, so you cannot be seen or heard. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box and we'll go over them at the end. This webinar is being recorded, so if you missed anything or you want to share it with anybody, feel free to check out Conservation Nebraska's YouTube channel. It'll be posted in a couple of weeks. And then lastly, at the end of the webinar, when we're doing the questions, there will be a short poll that pops up on your screen. It has about 3 questions. We would really appreciate you filling it out. It just helps Conservation Nebraska to improve on future webinars and events. Now, with all that being said, let's charge into the solar spectrum with Dr. Andrew Baruth. He is an associate professor in physics at Creighton University and has a multitude of research published towards solar energy. Along with teaching, Andrew trains and advises undergrad students, as well as being active in the community through curriculum writing, helping with Boy Scouts, and developing renewable energy strategies for nonprofits and colleges. I will now hand it off to Andrew to get us started.
All right, thanks, Brianna. And I have to say, it's very weird to lecture to a non-audience, but I'll do my best. I'll try and keep the energy up. So yeah, thanks again for that introduction. I'm excited to share with you today a little bit about the solar array at Creighton University in particular, but also a little bit broader in terms of our solar energy education initiatives. And also at the end, I want to kind of give you some ideas of how you might go solar yourself. So consider this a virtual tour of the array that's back there. All right. So I have a few goals, right? So I want to introduce you to that array and take you on a tour as though you were on site with me. I do love to give tours of that array. And sadly, we'll have to do it virtual, but that's okay. We'll try and make sure it's still a treat for you. I then want to briefly talk a little bit about how we have designed a curriculum that really surrounds the concepts of solar energy. Then I want to briefly talk about how solar energy works for the uninitiated. So what a solar cell is, how it's basically made, and how that can be developed into a panel. And finally, in the last few minutes, I want to hopefully demystify some of the process that goes into going solar, in particular in our community and in Nebraska. So I hope you're ready to kind of join me on this ride, and I think it should be a good one. And I'll try and keep it to about 40-45 minutes. So hopefully you're raring to go. All right, so to kick it off, I really wanted to talk about, at its heart, what we were doing here at Creighton. So ultimately, about now 11 years ago, 12 years ago, we designed a science, technology, engineering, and mathematics program that was really intended to be this kind of technical professional teaching with a focus on autonomous thinking, problem solving, client engagement. But it wanted to give the students this background in engineering, but also have these touch points in social sciences, environmental topics, and we wanted it all to kind of funnel through this lens of sustainable energy. And so solar was our initial focus because that's where we got the money, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's grown to talk about wind energy, biofuels, sustainable building science. So all these things that kind of funnel around sustainability and sustainable energy science. And we're doing well with our alumni. This has been awesome. We have alumni that go into a variety of professions. That includes things like project management, building control systems. Some go on to be solid state physicists or material scientists. Others are now architects working in sustainability. So we have people going all over the place and doing these renewable energy jobs, but all across the country. And so that was kind of at the heart of what we really wanted to do. So like you were coming to campus, I'm going to guide you in and tell you a little bit about what we do in terms of renewables on our campus, and then focus on our main array to kind of show you how that looks. So this is an overview of our entire Creighton campus. So you can see Cummings Street up here, and then we're bounded by the interstate to the south. We have Highway 75 to the west, and then we're bounded by about 17th Street to the east. And so this really encompasses all of the Creighton campus. What I've tried to do here is kind of color code some of the things that you could see in person if you were willing to walk quite a bit around campus. And so we have this kind of yellow orangey color. This is all the solar electric installations. I'm going to talk about each of those in turn in just a second, but we actually have a variety of them. Some are more familiar with the one on Cummings Street, but we also have some additional solar around campus. We actually have some wind turbines on campus. And in fact, we're going to be installing 4 new ones very soon. I actually just talked to the electrician yesterday. And so that's happening really soon, but we have some wind turbines around campus. We have an entire geothermal installation for the building that sits right here. And we also have a solar thermal installations all across campus. These 2 are there for heating the spaces. And the one here on the Riggy building is there to provide hot water for the building. And so we have a variety of sustainable energy solutions. I want to focus on these 4 because I think they're the most obvious to kind of think about. So the first one being the Cummings Street array, and that's the one we'll focus most on today. It's an 85 kilowatt installation, and it's actually made up of 4 different kind of arrays that are built into one large array. Each of these arrays, and I'm showing, I guess, 3 here. There's actually a 4th one off to the east. Each one has about 105 panels, or about 420 total panels for this entire array. In addition to that array, we also have a small tracker unit. It's 3.4 kilowatt tracker unit, or about 16 panels. And so this is kind of our primary array. And then we have what we affectionately call the doghouse. And this is where all the electronics are housed. And this is where the students can mainly interact with the electronics of the array. But in addition to that, if we go around campus, we actually have a flexible laminate, photovoltaic laminate that sits on top of our fitness center. It's a 20 kilowatt system over there. And these are actually, each of these strips, it's kind of hard to tell from this Google Earth picture, but these are each 23 square feet strips of PV laminate. And this all leads to 3 different inverters. And so we have this technology as well. And then we also have a second tracker over to the southeast side of campus. And then we have these 4 vertical axis wind turbines. And it's actually these 4 that we're going to replace. It turns out vertical axis wind turbines were a fun idea 10 years ago, 12 years ago, but they didn't last very well. And so we're going to replace these with a more traditional wind turbine, like you might see, a smaller version of what you might see driving on the interstate or something. But all told, this is 120 kilowatts of power. And to give you some perspective of what that means, that would power about 40 homes. That's the equivalent of powering about 40 homes. Or for us, that's powering between 2 and 4% of Creighton's electricity consumption. So not a great amount. It takes a lot to offset an entire university, but it is a significant amount. So like everything we have on campus in terms of our renewables, students constantly get to engage with these things, whether that's doing kind of typical maintenance. So for example, Cummings Street likes to kick off a lot of dust. And so we get to wash these panels down about once or twice a year. Turns out it's actually pretty fun to take a power washer up on a power lift and spray these things down. But we also get to do things like electrical testing and maintenance on these panels as well. So here you see 2 gentlemen up in the lift doing some maintenance checks on these panels and doing some electrical testing. And so everything we have is really a lab. It's really a hands-on lab. And so where did this come from? It was constructed in 2010. After kind of a lot of consultation. It was a partnership between Creighton and the Department of Energy and Omaha Public Power District. And so all these groups came together to help with funding this project. It was a massive project at the time. In fact, it was the largest solar array in Nebraska when it was constructed back in 2010. So it was a really big enterprise. And ultimately, the funding for the array came out of a kind of stimulus package that Creighton had received from the federal government through the DOE. And so not only did it help pay for the solar array and the variety of renewables that we have across campus, but it also helped pay for things like our teaching facilities and made sure that everything that we did build, which to be fair is more expensive than it needed to be at the time, but it was designed explicitly for student learning. So for accessibility, to get students up there, being able to mess with the wires, all of these things. You wouldn't necessarily have to do that if it was on your rooftop, for example, but we tried to make it as accessible as we could. The other thing that we thought about when this was being constructed is that we are an urban school, right? We live in an urban environment. And so we also wanted to be a testing ground of whether or not we could actually have a solar and wind project that would work in an urban environment. So I want to focus in on this Cumming Street array, and I want to look at it again through that lens. So when this was designed back in 2010, we had to really be thoughtful being an urban design, in particular for parking. Anybody who's gone to college or university knows that parking is a nightmare everywhere, and it's no different at Creighton University. And so when this was designed, we had to think about how do we avoid some of the complications of parking. And it turns out that we lost 2 parking spaces when we constructed this array. So that's it's a win. And so the trade-off of losing those 2 parking spaces is that now, if you're willing to park over here and under these panels, you actually have this nice covered parking, which can protect your car from the elements. So from that standpoint, we thought it would be a win-win. It's also important to note that when we installed these on pylons, so you can see the pylons here that are holding it up, they're small enough that we can still save the parking spaces there. So really this is a very elevated system. It's anywhere from 12 at the bottom to upwards of 15 or more feet at the top. So it's very elevated. And so you can easily park underneath it. It also helps keep it from being touched, vandalized, whatever from the public, while also being visible and accessible by the public or by the students. And so it serves a lot of good purposes. Because from our standpoint, this is still just a learning lab, right? And so we want to keep that learning lab. And then we have, again, that small shed that sits off to the southwest of that array. Again, we affectionately call that the doghouse. And this is where all the power conditioning equipment sits. And to be fair, this is where the students will spend most of their time, because panels, they last for a really long time, 25, 30 years, and they don't really need a lot of maintenance except for an occasional clean. But what does need to be addressed on occasion is what's happening inside of the power conditioning equipment. So it might be a blown fuse, for example, or maybe a dropped communication when we're trying to talk to an inverter or a panel. So this is kind of where the students primarily interact. All right, so I'm going to take you around the array just a little bit. So again, this is kind of what the backside of the array looks like. And so you'll see, the panels are actually kind of boring on the backside. There's just this white color. And you see just 2 leads coming out of each panel. So that would be a positive and a negative lead, just like a battery. And for these particular panels, these ones are actually going into what are known as microinverters. So this actually converts the DC power from these panels to AC power directly at the panel, and then it sends it off to go to the grid. Alternatively, we have additional panels that do not get inverted right at the panel site, and they go in what we call strings, and they all go back to what we call then string inverters. So these string inverters, on the other hand, can handle quite a few panels. So maybe 3 to 5 strings, where each string might have 12 to 15 panels on them. And so this, for example, is a 7 kilowatt inverter. This is a 3 kilowatt inverter. And so we have a variety of strings that are all coming back here. So the title of this was a solar farm, but what you might call a solar farm, we just call it the classroom. This is where we go for a classroom. And so we also have, of course, the tracker out there that students can interact with as well. So let's take a closer look at both the fixed array and then the tracking array. So for the fixed array, again, I mentioned this earlier, we tried to use 4 different technologies for collection. So we have panels, and these were the panels that were really popular at the time. Now, it turns out some of these companies have gone by the wayside. Of course, some you might recognize. So we have panels from Sanyo. They're hanging out here. We have panels from Schott, which are hanging out over here. Here, I think. Sharp, which are hanging out here, and Evergreen, which are hanging out over here. And so we have these 4, again, kind of separate arrays all made up into one. Now, normally you would never do this for an installation, but again, this was for educational purposes, and we wanted students to see kind of 4 different technologies. Now, they're all pretty similar. They all still have that positive, negative terminal, but just so that they were kind of aware. And then again, I mentioned this earlier, but some of them will go to Fronius inverters, about half of them. And 244 panels actually all have individual N-phase microinverters, which convert it from that, again, that DC to AC right at the site. The communication from the array, it all kind of funnels into the doghouse, which sits right here. And then we have Ethernet lines that go back to main campus. And that way we can actually communicate with what's going on out at the array and make sure things are going okay. So then we also have the tracker, which students think is kind of neat. The thing that I think is most neat about it is if you look really, really close up here, you're going to see this tiny little box. So let me zoom out for you. So that tiny little box we call the eye. And it really is just that. It behaves just like an eye. And so its only job in the whole world is to look for the sun and keep the sun in its sights. So this is a dual axis tracker, which means it can go both east and west. It'll slew east to west throughout the day. It can also change its tilt throughout the day as the sun goes up and down as it's traversing from east to west. And the eye's job is to make sure that the panel keeps it in its sight. And so these were really popular 10 to 15 years ago because what you would get is a really big boost in efficiency. So to give you an idea of what that might look like, the fixed installation would look something like this gray curve in terms of its power up or energy output throughout the day. And it's very symmetric, as you can see. And of course, it kind of increases as you get to noon, and then it decreases as you get to the evening. And so it does kind of exactly what you expect. However, if you add now this kind of dual axis tracker that can track through the sun, you get more peak earlier in the day, more peak later in the day, and you end up getting a pretty big boost in your efficiency. So here's some locations that might, kind of show you how it differs across the country. But importantly, in Omaha, you can see upwards of about 35, 36% increase in efficiency. So that was great. And people thought trackers were going to be really important. Now, it turns out that the price of solar panels has dropped about 80% since this time. And so these have kind of lost their favor because there's a lot of mechanics, it's an extra cost. And so if you have the space, most people just go with a fixed array. But if space is an issue, or if you're really trying to eke out that efficiency for your space, the tracker is really working for you. I would also say that a lot of bigger arrays now are just doing a single axis tracker, which only goes from east to west throughout the day and doesn't worry about the tilt, because the tilt doesn't add a whole lot. And the single axis trackers only have one additional then mechanical component, which is a little bit easier to service. So I wanted to briefly say this, and this is really just in response to people in Omaha should be kind of aware that we have some construction coming. So we have the C.L. Werner Center for Health Sciences coming. And it turns out that its footprint got landed right about here. So it turns out that this is kind of a fun opportunity for us who love the array. So I've been here for 10 years at Creighton, and for 10 years, this is what I hear. You guys have a solar array? And the reason I think they say that is because if you're driving along Cummings Street, which is the primary way that you're going to see campus, or from the interstate, and you're never going to see this from the interstate, is you don't see a solar array. You see the backside of these panels, right? You see these kind of white looking things that look a lot like a carport or something that's kind of protecting the vehicles. And if you look at this thing from the south, kind of the easiest vantage point for students to typically see this array, the array is actually getting kind of difficult to see. So not a lot of people actually get to see our array, sadly. And so we have some future moves that we're going to be doing over the next year. And so we're actually going to be decommissioning this 85 kilowatt array. And we have 2 sites where we're going to divvy up these panels. And we actually have intentions then to even increase the size of this array with some new panels. Like I said, costs have plummeted about 80% since we built this. And so it's a good time to also think about going solar. So this is roughly the footprint of our new C.L. Werner building. You may have seen infographics of it on the news, for example, or in the paper. Again, it's going to sit right here at the corner of where Cumming hits Highway 75. There's going to be this new crosswalk that goes to the Chris complex, which is just south of Burt Street. And it is going to eat up some of our solar array. And so instead of salvaging kind of the eastern part of the array, we thought, well, let's just rethink what an array might look like. And so some of that array might go to the top of the Werner building, but along with potentially some new higher efficiency panels. But also we're looking at this location here. Right here is a chilling tower for chilled water. And for those, again, familiar kind of with the Creighton campus, 24th Street sits just to the east of this building, and 24th Street has been really revitalized in the last year or two to really make it a nice thoroughfare. We call it kind of the 24th Street corridor. And the hope is that if we have panels now at this southeast corner, these are going to be really visible as you're driving down 24th Street, and you'll be able to see this kind of beautiful array. So the vision should be that now, instead of seeing the backside, we'll be able to see the front side as you're driving north on 24th Street. So we're excited for that. My students, they don't know it yet. They'll know it in the fall when they get back, is that they get to be part of the decommission of this solar array and then the recommissioning of it. And so it's going to be a great opportunity for our current cohort of students. All right, so that's the array. That was the quick and dirty visit of the array. And that's about what you would get if we were in person either way. And this way I don't have to scream over the Cumming Street traffic. So this is fine by me. So what I wanted to just, you'll have to indulge me for the next 5 minutes, is I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we do with the array, or what we do in terms of building a curriculum that surrounds this idea of renewable energy, sustainable energy, and in particular solar energy. So along with building the solar array, when we became partners kind of with the DOE and OPPD, we also in tandem developed a new solar training and education program. And it was in that same pot of money that we built up this program. And the idea was that we wanted to build a 4-year interdisciplinary program. So people coming with backgrounds in math, physics, engineering, but also people coming from the social sciences side. And the first students entered that program in July 2011. And initially, although we've kind of transitioned away from this, we actually partnered with Metro Community College to teach some initial courses. We didn't want to be this to be specifically a technical training program. That's not necessarily what Creighton is for. We wanted this to be a real project management program. But we realized that having that technical knowledge was really important. And so we brought these people who had that technical knowledge from Metro Community College to really get our kids immersed in thinking about how a solar array is constructed, how it's installed, how it's maintained. And that's been great. And then in addition to that, over the past 10 years that I've been working with the program, OPPD has been an amazing sponsor for us, and they like to sponsor a lot of student experiences. And anytime that we can engage with the community, they tend to step up and really help us, either by sending us people that work for OPPD or financially helping us out. So it's been really great. And we've also over the years invited over a dozen kind of local, regional, and international companies to join an industry advisory council. And so they sit and review our curriculum, they assess our students, they assess the outcomes of our students. And it's really this idea that we want to make sure our students are always ready for jobs and always ready for employment opportunities. And so that's been a really great opportunity to keep them in line with what's happening, because as you can probably guess, the energy landscape is literally changing month by month, year by year. And it's important to get the experts in to make sure that we are staying at the cutting edge of how energy is being delivered across the country, and in particular, the Midwest. So this is just a brief view of kind of what our space looks like. So we do have a design space. There is a design component to a lot of what we do. We have things like 3D printers, laser cutters to actually kind of build things and think of the design components. We also have our own workshops, so students can build things both with hand tools or with power tools. This picture I just pulled out because I like it. They're actually building a solar panel from little tiny solar cells. And right now they're going through the encapsulation phase, which is kind of a pain in the butt, but so it's fun for me to actually view. So none of you will get the inside joke unless you've built a solar panel, but it's basically like covering this thing in snot and waiting for it to dry. Here's some students working on a wind turbine and getting that all wired up. And then, like I said earlier, we do some solar thermal stuff. And so this is actually a solar thermal panel that students designed and constructed, and they're just doing some tests on it to see how hot they could get the air. And so we really focused on energy diversification. We talk a lot about electric utilities, sustainable building science, all these different things, with the hope that by their junior year, students would have an internship in the industry somewhere. That could be at OPPD, TNASCA, HDR, an engineering firm here in the Omaha community or where they're from. And so that they're actually getting their hands dirty and doing something in the energy sector. And again, hoping that they'll have a job waiting for them upon graduation. So to do that, we have to talk about grid tied pieces. And so they do a lot of design work for grid tied installations. So that might be looking at solar siting, for example, to figure out, is this a good spot to put a solar panel? And so we've done a variety of those. It's going to necessarily talk about finances and what is the return on investment. And so thinking about, at what day do we break even on a particular installation, and give some kind of parameters for that to really make sure that people feel comfortable about going solar. We also do off-grid strategies. So that might be things like solar hot water heaters, hot air collectors, as I mentioned before. But it might be simple like making solar powered security lighting. And this is a good way to get people introduced to the basics of how solar cells work and some of the simple things that you can do. And all the way up to some off-grid power. So maybe for lighting for a building, which was what this was for example. So we do a variety of things in terms of education. We do some engagement pieces. We've worked with Omaha Henry Dorley Zoo. We've worked with the Scouts. We do things in terms of solar siting with youth, just to kind of get people, in particular the Omaha community, to understand how solar works. We also work with a variety of clients outside of Creighton. So we've worked with people like No More Empty Pots, again, the Omaha Henry Dorley Zoo. We've helped design some curriculum. We work for the the Institute for Latin American Concern in the Dominican Republic. We had students that got to go visit, lucky them, and go to the DR and help with a 98 kilowatt solar array that was being installed there, and to make sure it was on-site evaluated. We helped design an array for Casa Cook in Costa Rica. So we get to kind of get our hands dirty all over the place. And we've been fortunate enough to get some pretty good public outreach and some accolades, whether that be helping OPPD in their community solar program, developing curriculum for the Omaha Henry Dorley Zoo. We got some press on Fox 42 a year or so ago, and the Reader, we were on the cover of the Omaha World Herald recently. So, or not recently, it was quite a few years ago, I suppose. But so we have gotten some good kind of public outreach, and it's been fun for us. So that was my 5-minute spiel. So thank you for indulging me. All right, so I was asked by Brianna when we sat down to talk about tonight. So I've given you the tour. I've talked a little bit about what we do at Creighton, but we were a bit worried that maybe there'd be people on that don't fully know how solar works. So I figured technically I am an expert, so I should probably be able to do this. The question is can I give you 3 years of education in 10 minutes or less? That will be the trick, but I'm up to the challenge. So I want to talk briefly about how a solar cell works. And we're just going to focus on the really simple idea of silicon. Most people who have heard of solar cells are familiar with the silicon solar cell. Everything I've shown you today is a silicon solar cell. These blue things that you see, these are silicon solar cells. So it's a good place to start. So I'm just going to kind of go through this in terms of questions, and usually I have an audience in front of me of students, but I'm just going to let you answer for yourselves. So if we talk about a solar cell, we really need to talk about light, right? The whole point of a solar cell is to take the energy from light and convert it into electricity. That's the whole point. So you may hear me use the word photon. So for the uninitiated, a photon is just a particle of light. So just a little chunk of light, if you will. So if you think in your head, if a photon hits something, what's going to happen? Well, there's really only 3 things that can happen, right? It might bounce off. That would be reflection. It might go through, like light going through a piece of glass, for example. So that would be transmitted energy. Turns out neither of those are interesting to me if I'm working on a solar cell. I worry about the third option, which is that the energy will be absorbed. So what does it mean for a photon to be absorbed? It's actually, believe it or not, an atomic scale event, right? So for a photon to be absorbed, that means that the photon energy has to be big enough that it goes into an atom and it kicks out an electron. And by doing so, it loses the electron by gaining the energy of the photon. And so it's okay, it allows it. And there's always a cutoff for this. And so for silicon, it has to have a particular energy for this to happen. And it turns out that this is right in the solar spectrum, which is why silicon is perfect. So the light coming from the sun is essentially ideal for silicon to eject electrons. So the process of ejecting the electrons due to a photon is called the photovoltaic effect, which is why sometimes solar cells might be called PV or photovoltaics. It really comes from this really basic principle that the energy of the photon will get transferred to the electron and kick it out. Once it gets kicked out, we want to do something useful with it, right? We want it to go power something. So if we think about how electrons move, right? Moving electrons are really all we need to make an electrical current. And that, of course, is the main purpose of a solar cell, is to create an electrical current. Electrical current is what's going to do the work for us to light a light bulb, to run a car, whatever. We need that electrical current to make electricity. So we need to start thinking about how would we get electrons to move, right? That's what a solar cell's job is to do. The electrons already exist. Solar cells don't create electrons. They're already existing. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. But we need to get them to move, right? And because that's what a current is going to be. So that's our first question. How, if we can eject an electron, how can we move it, right? So this graphic isn't helping, right? So electrons are tiny. They're infinitesimally small, essentially. So we can't just go around and push them, as this might suggest. So we really have to kind of think about how do we move electrons around. So again, I'll answer the question now with another question for you to think about, which is how would an electron, this negative thing here, how would it interact with a positively charged object? So I'm hoping to pull from your maybe grade school knowledge or high school knowledge or maybe even college knowledge about charges. And that's all the time I'm going to give you. So hopefully you remember this kind of rubric that opposite charges attract and like charges repel, right? And so if we can utilize this fact, we can maybe force electrons to do what we want them to do, right? So the critical takeaway from this is that we need to be able to make something positive so that we can attract electrons, or we need to make something negative so we can repel electrons and push them. And it turns out for solar cells, we're going to have to do both. So how do we do this? And how do we do this with silicon? All right, so this is your quick chemistry lesson. All right, so let's talk about silicon for a second. So silicon is a really, really earth abundant material. It's all over the place in the Earth's crust. Otherwise, it's not that special, but it's gonna be really important for solar, mostly because, again, the energy it takes to eject an electron is really just smack dab perfect for solar energy. So the most important thing to note about silicon at this point is that it has 14 electrons that surround its nucleus. And these are in varieties of things called orbitals, but all you need to remember is that there are 4 electrons in what are known as the outermost orbital or valence shell. So it turns out that atoms don't really interact with each other except for with their valence electrons. So there's 4 of those. Now, again, from your high school chemistry class or your college chemistry class, you might remember the octet rule. So the octet rule tells us that things are happiest when they have 8 electrons. This is why all noble gases have 8 electrons, for example. And so silicon is not happy when it's by itself. So it's going to want to start grabbing onto other things to try and get more and more and more electrons. Now, it turns out that silicon with itself makes a beautiful crystal. So we can put silicon with silicon with silicon with silicon. And what happens is the silicon atoms decide to share their electrons. We call that covalent bonding. And if we look at a single silicon atom, you notice that it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons. So it's very, very happy if it's what's known as tetrahedrally coordinated, or it has 4 nearest neighbors. And so this is what we expect for silicon. It actually forms the exact same crystal structure as diamond if we were to use carbon atoms, for example. And so a silicon crystal really just looks like a diamond. So that's where we start the story, right? But notice that in none of this have I talked about making something positive or negative. Remember, those are the 2 critical things we have to do to push a current around. So silicon by itself isn't going to do much. I can take a chunk of silicon and put it in the sun, and it's not going to be very exciting. So I need to find a way to make it more positive, or I need to find a way to make it more negative so that I can have these alternate charges to push the electrons through and make an electrical current. So the easiest way to do this is through a process we call doping. So doping is a pretty straightforward process. but I think it will be helpful if I make it a little bit more visual. So here's what a silicon crystal looks like if we zoom in really, really far and look at individual atoms. And like I said, it makes a beautiful crystal structure. And this is the actual facets that you could cut and make it look like a diamond. So if we talk about doping, what we're really saying is that we have this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful crystal structure that goes on and on and on for kind of forever in terms of the atom scale. But we're going to sub out one atom. And this is one atom out of maybe millions, maybe even billions. And so that one atom is not going to change the crystal structure at all. In fact, that one atom is going to be like, I'm going to pretend to be a silicon atom, and I'm going to look like a silicon atom. I'm going to behave like a silicon atom, and I'm going to sit right in the site where a silicon atom should be and pretend to be a silicon atom. So the first imposter I want to introduce you to is the phosphorus atom. So this is one way that we dope silicon, is with phosphorus. So phosphorus looks exactly like silicon, except for instead of 4 valence electrons, it has 5. So now notice what's going to happen. We bring a phosphorus atom in, and again, it's going to change to make itself look like silicon. It's going to be an imposter as much as it can be. It's not going to disrupt the crystal structure, but it's going to have an extra electron, and it's not going to know what to do with that extra electron. So it becomes free. So this actually gives it a negative character because it has this extra electron, which is negative. And so for the rest of this, we're going to call it N-type, N-type for negative type. And so by adding phosphorus, we have now something that is kind of negative in character. Now we have to be careful because it's still charge neutral because we brought an extra electron, but we also brought an extra proton, and that's going to come in handy in just a second. So now we have our negative character thing, the N-type, but what about our positive thing? Well, we just go the other direction. We take something that has fewer valence electrons. So we look at boron, for example. Boron has 3 valence electrons, and again, if we put 1 in a million, 1 in a billion inside the silicon crystal, it's not going to change the silicon crystal. It's not going to want to do that. And so we bring in 1 less, and it's going to, again, try and share electrons, but it's just going to deal with the fact that it has 1 less, and it's going to introduce this thing called a hole. And the hole basically gives it a positive character, and for the future, we're going to call this p-type. So now we have an N-type and a p-type. Both are neutral, but they have a character to them that gives more free electrons or more free holes in that material. So now the question is what happens if we bring these two together? So I'll let you think about that for a second. What would happen if we brought these together? We have free electrons hanging out over here, and we have free holes hanging out over here. So we'll cut to the punchline. What ends up happening, we'll just have to wait a second. This is a GIF, so I have to, there it goes. Electrons are going to migrate across, and they're going to fill the holes, right? But when those electrons leave, they're going to leave behind something that is positive. And as the holes get filled, they're going to turn more negative. So voila, we have something that is positive now, and we have something that is truly negative now. And so these are the charges that we needed to be able to move electrons around and make a current. So again, electrons, it's going to start over again. Electrons will kind of migrate across, fill some holes, but it's going to leave back some positives, create some negatives. We're going to see some rearrangement, and we're going to see a positive strip and a negative strip. So the atoms stripped of their electrons are now net positive. They are actually charged positive. And so this creates what's known as a PN junction, not a clever name. And what it ends up doing is prevents more electrons from crossing. So notice if I'm an electron over here and I come this way, I say, oh, great, I want to come this way. Oh, wait, there's a negative charge. I got to go back. Similarly with the hole, I'm going to go this way. I'm going to go this way. Nope, there's a positive charge. I've got to go back. So now imagine that we've made a one-way valve. It makes all electrons go one way, and it makes all holes go the other way. So now imagine we can keep doing this over and over and over again, right? So every time a photon comes in, it ejects an electron, right? So a photon comes in, tick, 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 it ejects an electron. The electron's going to go over to the N-type side because of this positive charge. It's going to say, hey, there's a positive charge. Zoom, it's going to sail across. It's going to go hang out with his friends, and we're going to start building up electrons on this top surface. And we're going to start building up holes on this bottom surface. And it's just going to keep growing and growing and growing the more light we shine on it. And what this is called now is voltage, right? So voltage is like pressure. So it's like a faucet that's just waiting to be turned on, right? The pressure is there. We haven't given a current yet. So now all we have to do is give it a current or give it a place to go. So if we connect a wire across it, bam, now the electrons have somewhere to go. All these electrons that have collected on the n-type side that don't really like each other, right? Because negatives repel each other, but they're stuck there because of this PN junction, spill out through the wire and they create a current. So that was your 10-minute lesson on how a solar cell works. So I hope you learned something from it. But this is really the basics of how we produce a solar cell. All right, so by my clock, I have about 5 more minutes. So I'm going to talk really briefly about how you might go solar. So if we put a bunch of solar cells together, we create a panel. This is not terribly novel if you've ever seen a solar panel. And each solar cell is about 0.5 volt, and we add them in series. So if we add them like this, this is a 36 cell panel, so it'll be about an 18-volt panel. We can put all these together and we look at some kind of the basic components. We're going to need something like a charge controller. Maybe we want some storage. If we want to be able to put it to like a wall outlet or attach it to the grid, we're going to need some way to take it from DC to AC through an inverter. There are a variety of sizes, right? So the residential scale, again, is about 5 kW. The factory is going to be, more like a megawatt. And to give you a sense of size, a megawatt takes about 5 acres of land. Utility scale, there are 2 5-megawatt systems in Nebraska that I'm aware of. Those can be in excess of 30 acres, so they really start to take up some space. All right, so you want to go solar. What is that going to mean? This is going to be the briefest of overviews, but I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the biggest numbers to worry about. So in terms of costs, obviously you're going to have to buy the panels, the modules. You're going to have to buy some inverters. And then you're going to have to buy the rest of the stuff, which we call balance of system. So this is your wiring, your racking, batteries if they're required, and then also your soft costs, like your labor costs, anything that's going to be required to actually get permits for this, for example. So if you're wondering, the average cost in Nebraska right now for a 6 kW system, which is about the average size for a home, is about $15,000 to $17,000 if you're paying cash. Of course, that's going to go up a little bit if you're taking that out on a loan. And there are a variety of other strategies to actually get a solar array, like leases and power purchase agreements. Again, prices have plummeted about 80% in the last 10 years. So this is about $2.80 per watt installed. So you can kind of see what it would take if you went a little bit higher, or a little bit lower. And nationwide, this currently ranges from like $240 to $322. So we're smack dab in the middle in Nebraska for kind of the cost for installing solar. So right now we do have a little bit of incentive to do it. There is a federal tax credit. It's actually being graded down right now from 30%, but it was just recently extended at the 26% level. And so you can actually get a 26% tax credit for that 6 kW system. That's $4,000. If you can't take it all in 1 year, you're allowed to roll it over to the following year. And so again, you have some great options to go solar. And if you kind of kick around those numbers and do a back of the envelope calculation, all told, current payback times in Nebraska are about 6 to 7.5 years, which is pretty great. And think about that. So once you've paid it off, now you're just making money, and for the most part. And so over a 25-year lifetime, which is the typical warranty of a solar panel, you might be making $50,000 to $60,000 over that lifetime. So at this point, it's starting to become a net benefit to go solar. One of the things that makes it most flexible to go solar is the thing called net metering. So net metering is basically a relationship that you have with your utility company where you share power with them. And so let me just introduce this really quickly with a few graphics. So imagine in the morning, right? So you have some solar panels and you're using basically every electron that you're ejecting, right? Because the sun's not very high in the sky and you're not really doing a lot. And so you don't really need the utility at this point. However, what happens when you start getting to the afternoon, for example, and the sun's high in the sky? Now you're making excess energy. What are you going to do with it? You could store it on site in a battery. You could throw it away, or you can share it with somebody. And so what net metering says is that we're going to share it with the utility. We're going to say, hey, utility, we see that you could use some energy. Here's some energy for you. And we're going to get some credit for that. And the beauty of getting the credit for that is that maybe later it gets cloudy, or maybe we have Nightfall. Oh, well, we won't maybe have Nightfall. We will have Nightfall. And so now we can take those credits back and say, hey, all afternoon we've been giving you extra energy. I want that back overnight to run my air conditioner or whatever, right? So we do this kind of trading relationship. And to do so, then we can design an array that actually covers 100% of your load, even at night, right? So this is how these tend to be designed. Just to give you an idea, about 93% of solar installations are net metered. So this is super, super, super common. So I'm not going to take the time to watch this video, and I don't know how well it's going to come across on Zoom anyway. We'll see if it'll start or stop. But the thing that I want to take from this video before I let you go, and we go to questions, I think I stopped it, is that you really need to go and talk to your energy provider before you start any solar project, because there are agreements that need to be made. And I also think that you probably need to go talk to a licensed solar installer in your specific community that has worked with that particular power provider before. So if you're in Omaha, you should talk to OPPD, and you should talk to companies in the Omaha area that have worked with OPPD before to build those solar arrays, because there are some arrangements that need to be made to make sure that net metering agreement is correct, to make sure all of the components that you intend to put on the grid makes OPPD happy and vice versa. So there's really these things that you need to take care of. I've given this URL here, but really just go to OPPD or LES or whatever your power provider is, and just Google or whatever, search on them and talk about how to get started with solar. And you can get an idea of who to talk to, who to email, and make sure that you involve them really early in the process so that you're not dealing with things on the back end. So with that, I really want to thank your attention. I want to thank Brianna and Conservation Nebraska for inviting me. It was fun to kind of prep this talk. It was really fun to actually go through all the pictures I've taken over the last 10 years and utilize them in this talk. I'm happy now to take any questions that might have popped up in the chat or any discussion points that may have been brought up. So thanks again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So first, before I start anything, if you guys have any last minute questions, drop them in the chat now and we'll get to them. Otherwise, a poll is about to pop up on your screen, and we would really appreciate if you guys did that super quick and easy. But otherwise, I will get to the questions. So John asked, have you experienced any weather damage to the panels?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the common things that we run into on primarily the big solar array is that we get an over voltage on occasion. And we're not exactly sure why this happens, if it's due to like nearby lightning strikes, or it just happens to get too sunny or something. And it'll just simply blow a fuse. And so thankfully we have that communication, so we can kind of see when an inverter decided that it just stopped working. And it's really just as simple as going out and changing a fuse. We did have a hailstorm, gosh, it was now 2 or 3 years ago. And we do have 3 panels that are out of service currently because of those hail strikes. But it's important to note that one, these are old panels, but even back then, panels were designed to take on about 100-mile-an-hour fastball, and they've only improved since then. So the panels themselves are really robust to weather, is what I would say.
Awesome. And then we have another question. It says, does MCC have any solar/storage curriculums?
That's a great question. So I don't work for MCC, so I can't answer that one exactly directly. I know they did at some point. And what I think it is now is it's more of an ad hoc system. And so they kind of wait to make sure that there are kind of a cohort of students that would be interested. And then they offer courses as needed for those who might be actually studying to be electricians, for example, but want to have that kind of solar energy to do that work. And so sometimes that happens at Metro, sometimes that happens over in Iowa, and Iowa Western, sorry, is the name. And so I'll see courses popping up left and right, and I see that question just got asked in the Q&A. That's typically where I'll see courses for this. There are also professional organizations that think about this. So there is the IBEW, so the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. They actually do courses for their the people within their union. to make sure that they are ready for doing wind, for doing solar. And so they offer some courses within their group. And then there's also professional organizations outside of educational ones that you can Google basically. And so there's the like SEIA, I think is one of them. That's Solar Energy International. And they offer kind of a hybrid, probably fully now online courses for solar installation.
Awesome. That's great. I love to hear that there's so many opportunities out there. So Martin asked about kind of how the cell all works. Is electron configuration easier in elements with configuration D and P? And then a prior question that I wasn't really sure on, he said the configuration in the solar panel could be in series or parallel. In case positive, which advantages each configurations have?
I follow the answer. So,
Okay.
all right. So I'm going to start with your second question, and then I'll jump to the first. So the idea is, right, so some of these panels will be wired in series. So when we say series, we mean that a positive is connected to a negative, connect to a positive, connect to a negative. So it's like a chain, right? And so we'll do that when we want to increase voltage. So when we add things in series, we want to increase the voltage. And sometimes that's important. So when we make our strings to go to the inverter for a string inversion, this is something we want to do. But we don't want to get too high a voltage. So we look at our inverter and we say, well, what is the kind of ideal voltage for this particular inverter? And so for ours, for example, it's about 350 to 500 volts. And so we add panels in series, in series, until we meet that voltage criteria. But that's not necessarily all the power we want to put into our inverter. And so then we start making strings in parallel. But the typical configuration is that you have many strings, and then you put those strings in parallel, and they all need to be of a similar voltage, excuse me, to go into a string inverter. So it's really a combination of both. The advantages of picking one or the other is really what voltage do you need? So let's say you're going to do battery backup. We don't have 500 volt batteries. You don't want a 500 volt battery. So if you're going to do a battery backup, do a lot of parallel connections, right? Keep that voltage low, but keep the power high. It means you can't run long lines, but if you're running a battery, who cares, right? You can keep the battery right next to the solar panels. But if you're not worrying about a battery, keep that number high for voltage, because that means it can travel a lot further, right? And so we're not worried so much about losses over the power lines, right? So this is why we keep power lines, OPPD keeps power lines at 17,000 volts, right? So we want to keep that voltage really high because we can transfer it much better and much further. So it's really a question of what's better there. As far as the electronic configuration, you have to come take a material science course with me. But generically speaking, electrons that are further from the nucleus. And so I think what your question is asking is the p electrons, which are quite close, as opposed to d electrons, which are a little bit further away. The further away you get from the nucleus, the more likely you are able to remove it from its host atom. But that's not always true. It really depends on the orbital configuration. So the answer is much more complicated than I want to give without a diagram.
Great. That was a great explanation though, because I was a little lost, so that's perfect. Pat asked, what percentage of residential systems on average have a battery storage system installed?
Pat, I wish I had an answer for you. I don't know the answer to that question. I would say that in the literature, it's often commented that it's dramatically increasing is what I would say. So hybrid systems, that's the language that you would use. If you're Googling, for example, hybrid systems are really on the rise. And so I think there's a concern about, one, keeping your own energy and doing less net metering, because net metering rules are constantly changing. And so some people want to have that kind of autonomy to make sure that they're getting to keep their energy and keep their money. And so you're seeing more and more, as battery prices have gotten cheap as well, just like solar panels, as those have gotten increasingly cheap, people are like, all right, I'll go throw a power wall in my garage and just keep that energy. And so they're on the rise, but I couldn't tell you what percentage, in particular our community, but they're certainly on the rise throughout the country.
Awesome. And Olaf asked, how efficient, how efficient of a panel is, how much efficiency of a panel is lost per year due to factors like material fatigue, etc.? Is it a significant factor for calculating efficiency over time?
That's a great question. It's actually, it was in my notes for the talk, but I realized that I was getting a little wordy at the beginning. So I cut it. So most solar panels are guaranteed to drop no more than 10% in their first 10 years of life. So being 90% efficient, and then an additional 10% over the rest of their life. And that's typically 25 years. So, what that's saying is that they should still be 80% of their full efficiency even after 25 years of life. And when these claims were being made 15 years ago, people were like, great, great, great. But they're turning out to be true, right? So solar panels do have a real lifetime, 25 to 30 years, and they tend to maintain their life throughout that. Of course, they're going to degrade. They're in the sun all day long, but they are protected with that glass coating, this kind of iron filled glass coating to make sure that they're not getting too much ultraviolet intensity, which could potentially damage the panels. And so that they really do last forever. The thing that actually tends to fail is the encapsulate, the snot that dries. Even though it's this beautiful stuff that lasts forever, eventually the UV is going to make it start to crack. Once it cracks, bad things start to happen. Water leaches in, and your solar panel is going to start to die. But we have 420 panels, of which 3 don't work. So that gives you an idea, and that's after 10 years. And that was because of hail strikes, not because of anything else.
That's great information. And George asked, how does solar energy compare to wind turbines? Is it cheaper?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and it is a little bit complicated. So my answer is going to be oversimplified, so I apologize for that. But so it really depends on land usage, right? So the reason that we see a lot more wind in the Midwest as opposed to solar, where solar we're seeing much more of that in like the Southwest, is really about land. So the Midwest, we're farmers and we love our farmland, and that's important. That's a big piece of our economy. And so wind turbines give a lot of bang for the buck for area, right? So we can put a huge wind turbine, 2 megawatts wind turbine, and it only takes a relatively small plot of land that they might lease from a farmer. And so the farmer's happy, they get some money, and utility's happy because they get some relatively cheap energy. A solar array, on the other hand, which actually is a little bit cheaper to build, the land is more difficult, right? So as I mentioned before, if you want to build something utility scale like 5 megawatts, you might be talking about 30 acres of land. And so that's real dollars when you're talking about, potentially farmland or location for homes. And so that's really becomes kind of the conflict there in terms of whether you should go solar or wind. Solar has dropped in price significantly, such that solar is typically the cheaper option until you start evaluating land prices. So again, that was a very oversimplified answer. My contact information is there. I would be happy to answer that more fully offline.
Awesome. And I will be sending an email to everybody with some more information that we talked about too, just so throw that in there. Jamie asked, who would be a good resource to evaluate community-based, like a neighborhood-owned, not OPPD owned solar storage project feasibility?
That's a good question. So I assume some of these people are on from Nebraskans for Solar. This is probably a good group to start chatting with in terms of this. I would say that people have tried to do some of these things with the storage component, not so much, but I know some people, just because I happen to live in this neighborhood for a while in Lincoln, were able to petition to put in a community solar array that wasn't necessarily associated with LES. And we're able to do that in a 100 kilowatt, I think, system. And so there are some precedents for that. I don't know about the storage component. There are caps on terms of what we're allowed to net meter with our utility. So Nebraska sets a cap at 25 kilowatts, and then local jurisdictions can change that to that's the minimum. They can go higher if they choose to. And so that tends to be a big barrier if you want a net meter. If you don't care about net metering, you have a lot of flexibility because it's your solar array, it's your land, it's your stuff. And so nobody can really tell you what to do at that point. But as soon as you want to interconnect with the grid, if you want to interconnect with Nebraska Public Power or Omaha Public Power or LES, then suddenly you have to start talking with them and seeing what they're okay with. So I don't know exactly who the best people to be talked to, but it would likely be your power company and see what they are comfortable with. So for example, in our array back here, this is an 85 kilowatt array. But net metering rules in OPPD would say that we can't have anything above 25 kilowatts. So we're not able to net meter with this array, but that's okay. It's our energy. So we just use it all. And so we don't share it with OPPD. So we don't do that net metering process that I described. And so from their perspective, they don't care because we're creating our own energy. We're using it locally on our campus, and they don't really get to see it on their end. We're not sharing it with them. And we're just continuing to buy energy. So they don't have much kind of say, if you will, in what's happening, what we might say behind the grid. Or behind the meter. So as long as you're working kind of off the grid, nobody's going to probably say a lot. I mean, obviously you need to have it checked out by electricians and whatnot to make sure it's safe. But as far as your power company, it's not going to be as big of an issue. But I would talk to them first. And then, like I said, there's probably some good experts that are not me in groups like Nebraskans for Solar who deal with this a lot more than I would.
Wow, thank you so much. And great job. Thank you for all the questions, everybody. They were all fantastic. And thank you so much, Andrew, your talk and your tour. It was just fantastic. I couldn't get enough. So thank you, everybody, for coming and learning with us today. We really appreciate each and every one of you. Again, my name is Brianna Coma with Conservation Nebraska, and I'll be sending a follow-up email tomorrow with some more things that we talked about and some of the links to throw in there that you guys can look at. If you guys have any other questions, always reach out, feel free. Otherwise, check out our Facebook page for more upcoming events, and we really hope to see you all at future events. Have a great night, everybody, and thank you again, Andrew.
Thank you.